Alaska isn't for the faint of heart. It's more than just a state, it's a frozen continent that demands respect and blood. In a land ruled by apex predators and relentless cold, only the bravest souls survive. Good evening, friends. Please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help me reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. Now, settle into the darkness and listen closely. Here are 4 true horror stories from the last frontier. Welcome to the cold. I have spent 30 years of my life making the world legible. That's how I'd always thought about cartography, not as a technical discipline or even a science, but as an act of translation between the chaotic, indifferent language of geography and the human need for things to make sense, to have edges and measurements and names. I've mapped coastlines in Maine and ridge systems in Colorado and river deltas in Louisiana, and every time I stood over a finished map, that particular satisfaction would settle over me like a warm blanket pulled tight against cold air. The world, impossibly complex and enormous, rendered knowable. Rendered safe. I was 51 years old and I'd spent so long mapping places that I'd forgotten to map myself. That's not metaphor. That's diagnosis, the kind my therapist in Portland had offered the year before with gentle eyes and carefully chosen words, explaining how people who organize the external world often do so at the expense of their internal one. I'd stopped seeing him when I took the Alaska contract because Anchorage was a long way from Portland, and because part of me suspected he was right in ways I wasn't ready to confront. The contract was with the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, updating trail markers and access routes in the Chugach Mountains east of Anchorage. Sounded straightforward. The existing maps dated from the 1990s, before climate change had redrawn glacial boundaries and erosion had rerouted dozens of drainages. My job was to spend 3 weeks in July hiking every documented trail, verifying coordinates, correcting discrepancies, producing updated maps that recreational hikers and emergency responders could trust with their lives. I've thought about that phrase a lot since then. Trust with their lives. I set up my base camp 12 miles east of the trailhead off the Hicks Creek Road, which put me about 40 miles from Matanuska in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley. My nearest neighbor was a ranger station 15 miles west that was staffed only on weekends. Cell service was predictably non-existent. I had a satellite communicator for emergencies, a GPS unit, paper maps, and the particular kind of professional confidence that comes from having done exactly this kind of work dozens of times in dozens of remote locations without incident. What I didn't have was anyone who would notice if I went quiet. My daughter Elena called every Sunday from Phoenix, brief conversations that followed the same comfortable ruts. How's the weather? How's the work? Send photos when you can, and I realized somewhere around the second Sunday that I could script those calls in advance and she might not notice the difference. Not because she didn't love me, but because we both allowed our relationship to calcify into ritual without substance. My ex-husband had a new family in Juneau, a younger wife and 2 small children I'd never met. I had my work in my maps and the singular satisfaction of making the world legible, which was increasingly feeling less like a life and more like an avoidance strategy for one. The first discrepancy appeared on my 3rd day in the field, July 9th. I was verifying a trail segment that ran along the east ridge of Castellan Peak, a route that appeared on the 1994 maps as a straightforward traverse at roughly 5,000 feet. My GPS showed the trail markers deviating 300 meters south of where the documentation said they should be. Not unprecedented, markers got moved by rockfall, washed out by snowmelt, relocated by previous maintenance crews who forgot to file the paperwork. I updated my notes and moved on. The second discrepancy was harder to explain. On July 12th, a maintained trail that multiple hikers had documented online within the past year simply wasn't there. Not overgrown, not washed out, the topography itself was wrong, the shallow drainage that should have provided the trail's natural corridor replaced by a steep rock face that would have required technical climbing to navigate. I checked my equipment twice, cross-referenced with paper maps, walked a quarter mile in either direction. The drainage was gone. Had been gone long enough that there was no evidence of its previous existence. I photographed everything, made detailed notes, and told myself there were explanations. Glacial till movement, subsidence, a feature that had been misidentified in the original survey. But the wrongness sat in my chest like a stone, cold and heavy, the same feeling I get when a map didn't resolve, when the data refused to form a coherent picture. The third incident happened on July 14th, and it was the one that should have made me leave immediately. I was documenting a junction on the northeastern slope, a Y intersection where two trails split, the main route continuing north toward the glacier overlook, the secondary route descending east toward a series of alpine lakes. I'd been here before, 2 days earlier, and I had photographs and GPS coordinates confirming the exact location of both trail markers. One of the markers had been moved, not replaced or relocated by erosion or wind. Physically pulled up and repositioned about 30 feet to the west, pointing hikers down a slope that had no trail, that terminated in a cliff face dropping 200 feet to a boulder field below. Someone had moved it to redirect people toward a deadly fall. I stood there for a long time, looking at that repositioned marker, and my brain performed the same function it always did when confronted with data that didn't fit the model. It generated alternative explanations. Error in my earlier documentation. Parallel markers I hadn't noticed. My own GPS malfunctioning in ways I hadn't detected. Anything other than the conclusion that was assembling itself from the evidence whether I wanted it to or not. I photographed the marker, documented its position relative to the cliff, and started paying attention to different things. Over the next 3 days, I found 11 more redirected or deliberately misleading markers. Not random vandalism, I knew the difference between the casual destruction of bored teenagers and what I was documenting. This was systematic, methodical, conducted with knowledge of which routes hikers actually used and an understanding of which redirections would produce falls plausible enough to be ruled accidents. Someone who understood the terrain as well as I did, maybe better, had been working these mountains with the same precision and care I brought to cartography, mapping not geography but human vulnerability. Identifying the points where a wrong step meant death. On July 18th, I found the first skeleton. It was at the base of one of the redirected routes, in a ravine that wasn't visible from above, that you only stumble into if you were below the cliff line looking up or following the drainage to its source. The bones were scattered by what had likely been a bear, the remains of what dental work I could see suggested an adult. No pack, no gear, nothing that would have survived the bears that had clearly found the site before I did. I sat with that skeleton for a long time, trying to understand the full weight of what I was looking at. This wasn't accidental. Someone had engineered this death and manipulated the trail system so that a hiker following legitimate-looking markers would walk off a cliff in a place where the fall was always fatal and the body would rarely be found. 3 weeks later, after the authorities had searched the area, they'd find 2 more sets of remains in similar locations. 3 people dead in those mountains, all officially ruled accidental falls over a 3-year period, all on routes that I now knew had been deliberately falsified. But on July 18th, alone in that ravine with the afternoon sun dropping behind the western ridge and the temperature starting its predictable descent toward freezing, I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew was that I was alone in a remote wilderness with evidence of premeditated homicide, and that whoever had done this knew these mountains well enough to construct elaborate deceptions across multiple trails over multiple years, which meant they were probably still here, still working, still waiting for the next person to follow a redirected marker. I started moving toward my camp fast, not running but walking with the kind of controlled urgency that keeps your footing on unstable terrain, my mind cycling through options. Satellite communicator, yes, immediately, before anything else. Pack essential gear, first priority survival equipment in case I had to move without returning to camp. Then find high ground with clear satellite signal and call for help. I smelled the smoke before I saw my camp. Not the familiar with smoke of my own stove, but something acrid, petrochemical, warmly sweet. When I crested the ridge above my campsite, I found my tent still standing, but my satellite communicator melted into abstract sculpture, sitting in a puddle of scorched nylon that had been my equipment bag. Someone had been in my camp, had targeted my communication equipment with specificity and care, had left everything else exactly as it was, which was somehow more terrifying than if they destroyed everything, because it communicated a deliberate message: I know what matters. I know what to take from you. I know you're here. There was a trail marker planted in the center of my camp, freshly cut, pointing toward the western slope. Pointing, I realized with a lurching horror, toward a drop I documented that morning as particularly dangerous, a slope that looked gentle from above but turned abruptly sheer before the bottom. They wanted me to run. Wanted fear to override competence, wanted me to flee in the wrong direction in the dark. It was the same methodology as the false markers, using knowledge against people, using the gap between what the terrain appeared to be and what it actually was. I didn't run. I sat down, made myself eat something, made myself think. The ranger station was 15 miles west, too far to reach before dark in unfamiliar conditions. The trailhead was 12 miles east, more familiar terrain, and I had headlamps, emergency bivouac equipment, a GPS unit with the correct maps loaded. I moved at dusk, staying off marked trails entirely, navigating by GPS and my own survey notes through terrain I documented myself over the past 10 days. Rough going, unstable in places, but I knew it, and walked it and mapped it and memorized it in the way that only sustained professional attention produces. I heard him once, maybe 2 hours in. Footsteps on rocks somewhere to my left, deliberate enough that I knew he wanted me to hear them, wanted me to panic and bolt. I stopped, controlled my breathing, waited. The footsteps stopped too. We existed in that horrible equilibrium for maybe 2 minutes, and then I moved again, and eventually he fell behind, because he knew the marked trails and I knew the actual mountain. I reached my truck at dawn. Drove directly to the Alaska State Trooper Station in Wasilla without stopping, and I sat in the waiting room with dried mud on my boots and blood on my left palm from where I'd slashed it on a rock during the descent, and when the trooper asked me what had happened, I pulled out my notebook and started talking, because I had documentation of everything, because that's what I did, that's what I'd always done, made the world legible when it refused to be. They found him 7 weeks later, a former wilderness guide named Raymond Oster who'd worked these mountains for 12 years before losing his guiding certification following a client's death in 2019. A death initially ruled accidental, now being reconsidered. They found his camp in a cave system that didn't appear on any official map, found documentation of his activities, found a detailed survey of the trail system and notes identifying what he called failure points, locations where a redirected marker would produce a fatal fall with maximum reliability. My artery was nearly severed in the fall that happened as I scrambled into my truck, a jagged edge of door metal I hadn't noticed in the dark. I bled through the entire drive to Wasilla, too focused on getting there to register how much. They operated for 4 hours. Told me afterward that I'd been minutes from bleeding out in the parking lot. I went back to Portland. To my therapist, who listened to everything with the same careful expression and adjusted his original assessment, I didn't organize the external world as a substitute for understanding my internal one. I organized the external world because I'd grown up in a world where nothing stayed where it was supposed to be, where the maps were always wrong, and I'd spent 30 years trying to make somewhere, anywhere, legible and trustworthy. Raymond Oster found those places and made them treacherous again. Not randomly, not out of madness, but with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the most dangerous lies are the ones that look like truth, the ones that were the right markings and point in confident directions and only reveal themselves when it's already too late to change course. My memory is compromised now. Short-term retention, the doctors explain, damage from blood loss and the extended surgery. I write everything down because I can't trust myself to remember, and sometimes I look at my own notes and can't recall writing them. I spent 30 years making the world legible. Now I can't trust my own maps. Raymond is serving 3 consecutive life sentences at Goose Creek Correctional Center in Wasilla, 15 miles from where I started running. 15 miles from where he'd spent years turning the mountains into a killing field. My daughter Elena visited last month. We talked for 4 hours, real conversation, not the scripted ritual of before. She asked if I'd ever go back to Alaska. I told her I didn't know. Told her I missed it, which surprised both of us. Missed the clarity of the work, the directness of a landscape that was honest about its capacity for destruction, that didn't pretend to be safe. What I couldn't explain to her was the thing I've never been able to explain to anyone, the thing that keeps me awake more than the nightmares or the phantom pain in my arm. Raymond Oster spent 12 years guiding people through those mountains, keeping them safe, learning their terrain with the same dedicated attention I brought to mapping it. Something had broken in him, or maybe it had always been broken and the wilderness had just given it a context, a purpose, a craft. And I think about my own 30 years of making the world legible, of finding patterns and imposing order and reducing the terrifying complexity of geography to lines on paper, and I wonder what the difference was between us. What kept me on the right side of that line while he crossed it so completely? I've mapped hundreds of places. Hundreds of landscapes rendered safe and knowable. But I've never been able to map that. My ex-wife used to say I was better at reading rocks than people. She said it the first time as a joke, somewhere around year 3 of our marriage, and I laughed because it was funny and because it was true. She stopped laughing about it by year 9. By year 12 she wasn't saying it at all. She wasn't saying much of anything to me by then, just leaving post-it notes on the refrigerator in Anchorage about whose turn it was to pick up Claire from school and whether we were out of coffee. We ran out of coffee a lot toward the end. I think we both knew what that meant and neither of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud. The divorce was finalized in 2014. Claire was 16. She went to live with her mother in Juneau, which is about as far away from Anchorage as you can get inside Alaska, and I think that was deliberate on both their parts, and I think I deserved it. Here's what my life looked like in January of 2017. I was 52 years old. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Anchorage with a lease I renewed every year because the idea of buying something permanent felt like admitting this was it. I drove a 2009 F-150 with 200,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield I kept meaning to fix. I ate most of my dinners standing over the kitchen sink because sitting at a table alone feels worse than standing. Don't ask me to explain that, it just does. My colleagues at the Geological Survey had started throwing me retirement hints disguised as compliments. You know the kind. You've earned some rest, Dale. Nobody knows this terrain like you do. We'd want to archive your methodology, and I knew what they were really saying, which was that I was expensive and aging and increasingly difficult to insure in the field. My daughter called on Sundays. Sometimes on Sundays. I want you to understand this before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. I want you to understand that the Brooks Range was not just work for me. It was the one place on Earth where I was unambiguously necessary. Where 40 years of accumulated knowledge about fault lines and sediment and glacial movement was not a personality flaw but a survival asset. Where the silence wasn't loneliness but just silence, clean and indifferent, without the specific cruelty of a post-it note about coffee. I flew into Bettles, that paper-thin town 130 miles north of Fairbanks, population 20-something in winter, a lodge and a landing strip and nothing else that counts, on the morning of January 3rd feeling more like myself than I had in months. Maybe years. That's the honest truth of it, and it shames me now in ways I'll explain. The survey was routine. 4th time mapping that section of the northern Brooks. I knew the terrain intimately. I had filed all the correct protocols, satellite communicator, GPS, full emergency kit, check-in every 6 hours, extraction team on 48-hour standby out of Bettles. I had done this dozens of times. I was thorough. I was experienced. I was, for those first 36 hours, genuinely happy in a way that quiet, contained men sometimes are when they're finally alone in a place that doesn't require them to perform any version of themselves they don't recognize. The avalanche took me on day 2 at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, which in Arctic January means full dark had already been down for 3 hours. I heard it before I felt it, that sub-bass rumble that starts somewhere above the tree line and accelerates with a grotesque, mechanical urgency that no sound produced by wind or water or animals ever mimics. For seconds, maybe 5. I went down the way I drilled, arms over face, curl the body, create the air pocket before compression locks you rigid. 40 minutes to dig myself out in the dark with one arm half numb and my headlamp flickering from the impact. I lost the primary sled. Most of my food. My main lantern. My extra fuel canisters. What I kept, the reserve pack strapped to my body harness, one backup lantern, the satellite communicator, my sleeping bag rated to -40, roughly 40 hours of rations, and my rifle. I ran the inventory in my head twice, methodically, the way I'd always process bad situations, clinical, sequential, without the luxury of panic. Then I made camp in the shelter of 2 granite formations and called in my position update. The wolves started howling around 2 in the morning. I had heard wolves hundreds of times in 30 years of field work. I knew their vocabularies the way I knew rock strata, by pattern, by frequency, by what each variation signaled. One long howl from the northeast, 2 responses from the west, closer. Coordination. Then, silence. Total, instantaneous, collective silence. And here is what I need you to really hear, because I think people who haven't spent significant time in genuine wilderness don't fully understand this. When a wolf pack that has been actively vocalizing goes silent all at once, they have not become bored or distracted. They have identified something that makes communication more dangerous than useful. Something in the dark that they have collectively decided not to announce themselves to. I lay in my sleeping bag with my rifle unkissed across my chest and I listened to nothing for 2 full hours and I thought about what kind of thing makes apex predators decide that silence is the safer strategy. I told myself it was another predator. A wolverine. Maybe a bear, though bears den in January and that would be deeply unusual. I told myself my nerves were raw from the avalanche, that adrenaline does strange interpretive things to a tired brain. I thought about my apartment in Anchorage. I thought about the crack in my windshield. I thought about Claire's voice on Sunday phone calls, perfectly polite, perfectly managed, the voice of a young woman being careful around someone she loves but doesn't entirely trust not to disappoint her again. I thought, if something happens to me out here, that phone call this Sunday will just not happen, and it might be Wednesday before anyone is certain something is wrong, and that is an unbearable thing to think about life. The kind of thought that finds you at 3 in the morning in the dark. On the morning of day 2 I discovered something that rearranged every assumption I had made about my situation. My emergency pack had been accessed. I need you to feel the specific horror of what I mean. Not disturbed. Not knocked over by wind or dragged by a small scavenger looking for food smell. Accessed. The main zipper, closed and clipped with the safety tab I always engage, a habit from 20 years of field work, was open. The contents had been removed, examined, and replaced. I know this because the positioning was wrong. My first aid kit, which I store on the right side as a reflex of muscle memory built over decades, was on the left. My 2 ration bars, which had been stored stacked together, were side by side with a precise, uniform gap between them. As if measured. As if documented. The satellite communicator had been removed and replaced with the antenna facing a different direction than I store it, always face down, always. It was face up. Someone had inventoried my survival capacity while I slept. I stood in the blue-gray half-light of an Arctic January noon and I felt something I had not felt since I was approximately 8 years old and woke up certain that something was in my bedroom. Not fear of the dark. Not fear of weather or terrain or any of the rational, manageable fears I had built a professional methodology around. Pure, atavistic, childhood terror. The kind that doesn't respond to reasoning because it predates it. The kind your body produces when it knows something your brain hasn't fully processed yet. And then I thought the unthinkable. I thought it wasn't human. I know how that sounds. I am a geologist. I have a PhD. I believe in stratigraphy and plate tectonics and the slow, indifferent logic of deep time. But I am also a man who was standing alone in the Brooks Range in January with his emergency kit reorganized like an inventory manifest, and the alternative, that a human being had been close enough to unzip my pack while I slept 3 feet away and had chosen to inventory rather than act, felt less survivable to consider than the impossible. At least the impossible is indifferent. The impossible doesn't make decisions about you. I walked for 6 hours that day with my rifle on my shoulder and the safety off, which is something I had never done in 30 years of field work, and I want you to understand what that means, what kind of specific and visceral fear overrides 3 decades of disciplined safe handling instinct. The breathing started on day 3. I had stopped to take a compass bearing, approximately 9 kilometers from my extraction point, temperature at -28 and dropping, my body running on its last real reserves. I heard it behind me. Not an animal. I need to be emphatic about this because it matters. Animals breathe in patterns that suit their biology, their exertion, their attention. What I heard behind me was controlled. Deliberate. The measured, suppressed respiration of something that had made a conscious decision about the volume of its own breathing. The kind of breathing you do not produce by accident. The kind you practice. It was 20, perhaps 25 meters behind me. I kept walking. Every cell in my body organized itself around the act of not turning around, because some part of me understood, the ancient part, the part that predates geology degrees and divorce papers and Sunday phone calls, that turning around was a threshold. That as long as I kept walking forward, whatever was behind me was still making its own calculation. I adjusted my angle north toward higher ground and better sight lines, and I counted my steps, and I thought about Claire, and I thought about the crack in my windshield, and I thought about a post-it note that said we're out of coffee and how I would give almost anything to be standing in that kitchen reading it right now. The breathing followed me for approximately 600 meters. Then it stopped. I did not look back for 4 full minutes. I counted them. When I turned, there was nothing behind me but my own tracks in the snow and the absolute dark of the Arctic afternoon pressing down on everything like a weight. The rescue team reached me 5 hours later. Mild hypothermia. Acute stress response. I told the ranger everything, the pack, the wolves, the breathing. He logged it without visible surprise, which was its own specific category of frightening. They identified him from the evidence left at a concealed camp 2 kilometers from my extraction route, a survival installation of, according to the federal report, I was shown a portion of extraordinary sophistication and permanence. 8 months in the Brooks Range. A man wanted for 3 murders across 2 states who had correctly calculated that the Alaskan wilderness would not look for him the way civilization would. He had been there since the previous April. He had learned the terrain. He had developed patterns. They found a logbook. The federal investigator showed me 3 pages. Just 3. I have thought about why she stopped at 3. I think she stopped at 3 because she had read the rest and made a judgment about how much a civilian could process in one sitting without something breaking in them permanently. January 3rd, January 4th, January 5th. My movements. My campsite coordinates, more precise than my own GPS notes. The avalanche, documented with a timestamp. A notation next to January 4th that I was shown and that I will not transcribe here, but which concerned the contents of my pack and ended with a word, a single, handwritten word in small, perfectly steady letters, that has appeared in every nightmare I have had for the past 6 years without exception. They never established definitively why he didn't act. The forensic psychiatrist's report, which I obtained a portion of through my attorney, used the phrase selective target criteria and environmental assessment period and other clean, bureaucratic language for the concept of a predator deciding you are not yet worth the expenditure. Not yet. Those two words. I have spent considerable time with those two words. I live in the same apartment in Anchorage. I renewed the lease again. The windshield crack is still there. Claire calls on Sundays, more often now, since she knows what happened, and I think she calls more out of guilt than affection, and I accept this because it is what I have. I see a therapist on Tuesday evenings in a building on Tudor Road. She is competent and patient, and she uses the correct clinical terminology for what I experience, which is persistent hypervigilance with dissociative features and chronic anticipatory anxiety. She does not use the word horror, but that is the word I use in my own head, at 3 a.m., when I wake up in the apartment with the absolute certainty that something has been through my things while I slept and made its calculations and decided. Not yet. The logbook is in federal evidence storage. I know this. The investigator confirmed it. What nobody has confirmed, what I asked directly, twice, and received responses to that answered a different question than the one I asked, is whether the logbook entries stopped on January 5, 2017. Whether selective target criteria means he decided I wasn't worth it, or whether it means he simply hadn't finished deciding. His sentencing has been delayed 3 times. He is, as of the last notification I received from the federal prosecutor's office, expected to be remanded to a facility in the lower 48 sometime this year. Sometime this year. I checked my apartment locks this morning. Counted the windows. Verified the deadbolt. The crack in my windshield caught the January light in the parking lot, and I stood there looking at it for a long time, that thin, familiar fracture running diagonally across everything, and I thought about how long I had been meaning to fix it, and how some things you just keep living around, and how you never really know what's been through your things while you weren't paying attention. I went back inside. I did not eat breakfast standing over the sink. I sat at the table and faced the door, and I didn't move for a very long time. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only exists in Alaska, and I think you have to have lived somewhere flatter and louder first before you can feel it properly. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, subdivisions, strip malls, the particular beige ambition of the Chicago suburbs, and when I moved to Anchorage at 26 for a photojournalism residency that lasted 8 months and a relationship that lasted 11, I thought I understood what I was getting into. I didn't. Nobody does. Alaska absorbs people. It takes the thing you thought you were and holds it up against 20,000 square miles of complete indifference, and the comparison is not flattering. You find out very quickly whether you have a self that exists independent of witness, and a lot of people discover they don't, and they leave. I stayed. I'm still not entirely sure what that says about me. By August 2021 I had been in Alaska for 3 years, which meant I had survived 2 full winters and the particular psychological texture of coming out the other side of a second one, that specific, hard-won pride that Alaskans use to explain to each other why they're still here when they could leave. I was 29. I was freelance, which is the polite word for financially unstable, shooting wildlife and landscape work for a regional outdoor magazine and occasionally for national publications that paid well but infrequently. I lived in a studio apartment in South Anchorage with a radiator that made us sound like a small creature trying to escape through the pipes, and a view of a parking structure that became, in certain lights, genuinely photogenic. I was single in the way that people are single when they've stopped arranging their life around the hypothetical of someone else joining it. I ate dinner at odd hours. I slept diagonally across the bed. I talked to my camera more than I talk to most people, which is a thing you can admit to yourself at 29 without it feeling like a confession, but only just. I drove up to the Susitna Valley on August 14th for the Sockeye Run. The Susitna Drainage in midsummer is one of the most astonishing wildlife corridors in North America, and I say this as someone who has photographed in Yellowstone and coastal British Columbia and the Kenai Peninsula at peak season. When the salmon are running, the river goes predator-dense in a way that feels almost prehistoric. Brown bears everywhere, some of them massive, 600 pounds or more, standing in the current with a focused patience that makes them look almost meditative. Eagles on every snag. The smell of fish in cold water and something deeper underneath, something organic and ancient. I had driven up from Anchorage on the park's highway, past Wasilla and its particular brand of frontier strip mall sprawl, past Willow, and then off the highway onto a gravel road that followed a tributary drainage toward a section of river I identified from satellite imagery the previous spring. Remote enough that I'd be alone. That was the point. I need to be honest about something. I went alone on purpose, and not just for the photography. I had recently lost a contract. A significant one, a 6-month assignment covering subsistence communities along the Yukon River that I had organized my entire professional year around, dropped with a 2-paragraph email by an editor who had moved to another publication and taken his commitments with him. It wasn't just money, though it was also catastrophically money. It was the thing I had been able to tell people when they asked what I was working on, the thing that made freelance nature photographer in Alaska sound like a deliberate life choice rather than an extended accident. Without it, I was just a woman alone in a South Anchorage studio talking to her equipment. The river felt like the right place to be. Big enough to make that feeling small. I hiked in 3 kilometers from the trailhead at first light, which in August in the Susitna Drainage means a golden, oblique light that makes everything look like it's being shot through a filter you normally have to add in post. The bears were already working. 7 of them along the stretch I could see from my first position, 2 sows with cubs, 1 enormous boar that had claimed the best rapid for himself and was catching fish with a casual, brutal efficiency that was almost boring to watch until it wasn't. I spent 4 hours there. I shot 1,200 frames. I ate a granola bar at 9 a.m. and another at noon and didn't think about editors or contracts or the parking structure outside my apartment window once. This is what I came for. This is what the camera does. It gives you a reason to be exactly where you are and nowhere else, and for a person constitutionally inclined toward elsewhere, that is not a small thing. I had moved 2 kilometers upriver, following the bears as they redistributed along the run, when I looked across the Susitna and saw the woman. She was standing on the opposite bank, maybe 40, maybe 45 meters across the current, in a section where the river ran deep and fast over a gravel bar, no crossing, no bridge within 8 kilometers in either direction. She was wearing dark clothing that was wrong for the season, wrong for the terrain, wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate except that it registered as off the way things register as off before you've consciously processed why. A dark jacket, what looked like ordinary jeans. No pack visible. No equipment. Just standing at the water's edge facing in my direction. I raised my hand. I didn't wave, it was a tentative gesture, a half greeting to someone I wasn't entirely sure had seen me. She didn't respond. She was completely still in a way that was difficult to look at directly, the way certain things are difficult to look at because the stillness is the wrong kind. Not the stillness of rest. Not the stillness of observation. The stillness of something that has stopped mid-process. I lifted my camera. Not because I was thinking clearly, I wasn't, even then. Some part of me was already cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, but because looking at her through a lens felt less direct. Safer, in some instinctive, childish way. I found her in the frame, zoomed to 200 millimeters, and looked at her face on the LCD screen. Her eyes were closed. Standing at the edge of a fast glacial river in the Susitna drainage, 40 meters of cold water between her and the nearest person, she was standing with her eyes closed. Not squinting. Not blinking. Closed, in the composed, deliberate way of someone who has made a decision about them. I lowered the camera and looked with my naked eyes. She was still there. I looked through the viewfinder again to confirm what I was seeing, and when I looked up she had moved. Not walked. Not shifted. She was simply further downriver, 30 meters from where she had been, same posture, same stillness, same closed eyes. The distance between her original position and her new position was impossible to cover in the time I had spent looking through the camera. I had the timing in my hands. The buffer on my camera logs the interval between frames, and I know exactly how long I had my eye to the viewfinder. 11 seconds. In 11 seconds, on a gravel riverbank, she had moved 30 meters without my seeing her move. I want to tell you I reacted with the clean, decisive urgency of someone trained for emergencies. I didn't. I stood with the camera hanging from my strap and I looked at her across the water, and I felt the specific, cellular horror of wrongness, the feeling that something in front of you does not follow the rules you have spent 29 years unconsciously relying on to navigate the world. She was wrong. Her presence was wrong. Her movement was wrong. Her closed eyes in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness were wrong in a way that reached into something older than reason and squeezed. The bear saved me. Or rather, a bear did. I had been so focused on the woman across the river that I had committed the worst field error you can make in brown bear country. I had stopped tracking my surroundings. The cell I had last seen 200 meters upstream was now behind me, 40 feet, and she had her head up because I was standing still and making no noise and presenting an ambiguous profile, which is exactly what you must not do with a bear that has cubs. She wasn't charging. She was assessing. Big brown eyes, ears forward, nostrils working. Making a decision about me the way large predators make decisions about anything unfamiliar, by determining whether it is a threat, prey, or irrelevance. I did everything correctly. I spoke to her in a low, even voice. I turned to face her squarely. I moved sideways, not backward, creating lateral distance without presenting the retreat profile that triggers pursuit. I kept my eyes on her and I did not look back across the river. I heard her drop back to 4 legs. I heard her snort, that dismissive exhalation that means you've been categorized as irrelevant. I heard her move back upriver. Then I ran. I ran the 2 kilometers back to the trailhead with my pack balancing and my camera clutched to my chest with both arms, and the kind of sobbing breathing that you do when your body has been running on adrenaline for so long it forgets how to regulate oxygen. I reached my truck and I got inside and I locked the doors and I sat there shaking for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock, watched the numbers change, used them as a handrail. Then I called my local contact, a guy named Carl who worked out of Talkeetna, and he came and found me there and called the state troopers when he saw my face. I told them everything. Carl translated the geography for them, the river section, the distance, the absence of any crossing. A trooper named Guerrero drove me back to Anchorage and took my statement in a parking lot off Burgaw Street and was careful and professional and did not tell me I was imagining things, which was the most frightening response he could have given me. 3 days later, they found her. Her name was Katja Werner, 41, a German national who had separated from a guided trekking group operating out of Talkeetna 2 days before I saw her. She was found alive, 12 kilometers from where I had seen her, in a state of profound hypothermic dissociation, the specific neurological condition in which core temperature drop begins to affect cognition and perception, causing patients to wander, to perform actions without memory of them, to enter periods of apparent calm that are actually neurological shutdown. She had no memory of the riverbank. No memory of me. She was alive, but barely, and the treating physician at the hospital in Anchorage told the trooper, who told me later in a follow-up call, that another 3 to 4 hours of exposure would have been unsurvivable. 12 kilometers. She was found 12 kilometers from where I saw her, across a river with no bridge or fordable crossing within 8 kilometers. She was on the same side of the river as me when she was found. The troopers documented this discrepancy. I know because I asked, directly, in writing, and received a response that confirmed the geographic impossibility without explaining it. The phrase used in the written response was the subject's precise movements during the dissociative period remain undetermined. I have 41 photographs of her. 31 of them show her in positions that don't sequence correctly, that don't represent any continuous movement a human body could produce between the timestamps on the image files. I have shown them to a forensic imaging specialist at UAA who confirmed the timestamps are unaltered and offered no further comment. I have shown them to a physicist who studies motion capture. He studied them for a long time and gave them back to me without speaking. Katja Werner returned to Germany after our recovery. We have spoken twice by email. She is polite and grateful and remembers nothing of the Susitna. She asked me in her second email to stop sending the photographs. I stopped. I still have them. I don't look at them. But I know the exact number and I would know immediately if one was missing, which is a thought that should not occur to a sane person about photographs stored on a hard drive in a studio apartment in South Anchorage, and yet it occurs to me every single morning with the regularity and the unwanted intimacy of a thing that has moved in and doesn't intend to leave. I don't shoot wildlife anymore. I do product photography in a studio on Tudor Road, controlled light, measured distances, nothing outside, nothing alive. The radiator still makes it sound at night. I still sleep diagonally. But now I sleep facing the wall, with my back to the room, because something changed about the way I experience open space behind me. Something about the gap between one moment and the next, the 11 seconds I had my eye to a viewfinder and something that should have been visible wasn't, the small, annihilating gap between what physics permits and what happened on that gravel bank, broke something load-bearing in how I process the world. I moved to Alaska because I thought I needed something enormous to feel correctly sized next to. I found it. I wish to God I hadn't. My therapist in Palmer asked me once, during our 4th session, what I was really looking for when I drove 3 hours into the mountains alone to photograph the night sky. She asked it the way therapists ask things, gently, with the particular patience of someone who already suspects the answer and is waiting for you to arrive there yourself. I told her I was looking for the aurora. She wrote something down and nodded and didn't push it, but I could see in the slight tilt of her head that she knew what I hadn't said, which was that I was looking for something to feel enormous next to. Something that made my life feel correctly sized rather than just small. I have lived in Alaska for 11 years. I want you to understand what that means for a woman who moved here from Cincinnati at 35 following a man who turned out to be exactly as unavailable as all the warning signs suggested. He left after 2 years. I stayed, partly because I had already turned my life over to get here, and partly because Ohio felt like something I had already survived once and didn't have the energy to survive again. I had a decent job as a radiologic technologist at the Matsu Regional Medical Center in Palmer. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with good light in the mornings and a parking situation that only became genuinely unpleasant from November through March. I had a 12-year-old cat named Ptolemy and a subscription to Sky and Telescope magazine and a modified Canon EOS camera I had spent 4 months savings on. I had, in the specific and quietly devastating way of people who have made peace with the wrong things, a life. The Talkeetna Mountains were my escape hatch. Not Talkeetna the town, that charming, slightly performative little place 115 miles north of Anchorage where the tourists come for Denali views and the locals have the 1,000-yard stare of people who chose wilderness deliberately. I mean the range itself, the specific dark geography above the valley where light pollution from Palmer and Wasilla and Anchorage can't reach, where in December the sky becomes something you feel on your skin before you see it with your eyes. I had a route I used. A pull-off on a Forest Service road I discovered by accident in 2016, a flat granite shelf about 200 meters from the road, open to the northeast where the aurora most reliably performed. I had been there 14 times in 3 years. I knew the approach in the dark by feel. I drove up on December 19, 2019. A Thursday. I had worked a full shift, 2 chest CTs, a spinal series, a pediatric wrist fracture that made me think about things I try not to think about, which is children and whether I made the right decision about not having any and whether 46 is really the age when you stop having to revisit that question or just the age when you get tired of asking it. I stopped at a gas station in Wasilla for coffee and a sandwich I ate in the parking lot because driving alone and eating alone felt slightly more dignified than sitting inside. A family was loading their Subaru at the pump next to me, a dad in a Carhartt jacket wrestling a car seat, a mom on her phone, 2 kids in the back seat conducting what appeared to be a Cold War over a single bag of chips. Ordinary. Warm. The kind of scene you absorb through the glass of your own separate life and feel the distance of without being able to name the exact measurement. I got to the pull-off at 9:47 p.m. Temperature at -18 Celsius, which in December in the Talkeetnas is not remarkable but demands respect, the kind of cold that doesn't give you warnings, that simply begins the process of ending you if you make consistent mistakes. I had the right gear. I always had the right gear, because competence and preparation was one of the things I had learned to substitute for other things. I set up the tripod on the granite shelf, mounted the camera, attached the intervalometer, and let the first long exposure run while I made tea from my thermos and watched the northeast horizon begin to do what it does, that first pale shimmer that looks like a smear of something biological rather than anything cosmic, until suddenly it isn't pale anymore and isn't a smear and you understand viscerally why every human culture that ever lived under it built mythology around it. I was reviewing the first sequence of shots on the camera's LCD, the aurora filling the upper third of the frame in greens and a low, bruised violet, when I saw it. In the lower right quadrant of the image, in the dark foreground below the aurora, there was heat. Let me explain what I mean by this, because it matters precisely. My camera's astro modification removes the internal infrared filter. This allows it to capture wavelengths of light invisible to the naked eye, specifically the hydrogen alpha spectrum that makes nebulae photograph red. It also, as a secondary effect, makes it marginally sensitive to thermal contrast in certain conditions. In an 11-minute exposure at -18 degrees on a granite shelf with no ambient light pollution, a warm object leaves a ghost, not a photograph, not a clear image, but a smear of relative brightness against the cold stone. I had seen it before with small animals. A ground squirrel had showed up as a faint smudge in a 2017 series. What was in the lower right quadrant of that frame was not a ground squirrel. It was the unmistakable outline of a human body. Lying flat. Arms at sides. Head toward the camera. Completely, impossibly still for the entire 11-minute exposure. The smear was diffuse but unambiguous. I had spent 4 years learning to read what my camera saw in the dark, and what it was showing me was a person lying motionless on the granite shelf approximately 40 meters to my right, in a section I had not walked to and had not illuminated with my headlamp. My first thought was medical. Someone injured. Someone collapsed in the cold. At -18, 11 minutes of motionlessness and inadequate clothing is a genuine emergency, and I am a medical professional, and that reflex is older and more automatic than fear. I called out. I used my headlamp. I said hello and then is someone there and then I'm coming toward you. I'm going to help you because that's what you say when you think someone is hurt and you want them to stay calm. I walked the 40 meters with my headlamp on the ground ahead of me, sweeping left and right, and when I got to where the body had been I found nothing. No person. No equipment. No indication of recent presence except for what I found when I dropped to one knee and looked at the granite surface carefully in the direct beam of my headlamp. The snow that had collected in the cracks and depressions of the granite was disturbed. Not by wind. Wind disturbed snow in consistent directional patterns, and this was radial, compressed, the specific displacement that weight makes when distributed across a surface. The shape was preserved in the negative space of the snow. The shape of a person who had been lying there long enough to melt 2 centimeters of compacted powder with body heat and then was gone. The impression was still warm at the edges. I touched it with my bare finger for 1 second before the cold told me to stop, which meant it had been occupied recently. Very recently. And in the center of the impression, blade buried in a crack in the granite with the handle pointing straight up like something planted deliberately, like something meant to be found, there was a hunting knife. The blade was approximately 15 centimeters. The handle was wrapped in black paracord. There was no rust, no weathering, no accumulation of ice or snow on the handle. It had been placed there in the last few minutes, possibly while I was looking at my camera screen. Possibly while my back was turned. Possibly close enough that I could have reached out and touched whoever placed it. I want to be very precise about what happened in my body in that moment, because I think the horror of it gets lost when people tell stories like this afterward in safe rooms with good lighting. Every system in me went quiet at once. Not the loud, cinematic panic of the movies. Something worse, a systemic shutdown, the physical equivalent of a computer encountering a process it has no protocol for. I stood up. I did not make a sound. I turned in a slow circle with the headlamp, which was the worst thing I could have done because the beam only illuminated the 6 feet in front of it and turned everything beyond it into an absolute, featureless black wall. Wherever the light pointed was safe. Everywhere the light was not pointing was where anything could be. I walked back to my equipment. I did not run. I have thought about this a great deal in therapy, why I didn't run, and I think the answer is that some part of my brain understood that running creates sound and movement and presents a profile, and that stillness and silence were the only tools I had. I broke down the tripod in the dark without using the headlamp. My hands were shaking badly enough that I dropped the camera once and didn't stop to check if it was damaged. I put everything in the bag and I walked to my truck and I drove. I called 911 from the truck, moving, before I had reached the main road, and the dispatcher told me to drive to the Palmer State Trooper post and not to stop. I did not stop. The investigation took 4 months. What they found on that shelf, in addition to the knife, was evidence of multiple prior visits, partial boot impressions under layers of snow that the forensic team dated to at least 3 separate occasions. A small thermal flask, empty, half buried under a rock outcropping 20 meters from where the body impression had been. Boot prints leading to and from the Forest Service road from a direction different than the pull-off I used, suggesting a parking point further along the road, a deliberate approach that avoided the single sight line from where I typically stood. He had been to that location before. He had been there when I was there before. They found him in May 2020, attempting to approach a woman photographing the Perseid meteor shower outside of Talkeetna. His name is in the court record. He is serving multiple sentences in a facility I will not name here because knowing where he is does not make me feel safer, and I have learned to stop chasing the feeling of safety because it is not a destination I seem able to reach. What the prosecutor told me, in a meeting at her office in Palmer last year, was this: the knife was a signature. A behavior documented in 2 prior cases, one in Idaho, one in Montana, where he had approached women observing at dark sky sites alone at night. In those 2 cases, the knife had been left as what the forensic behaviorists called a deferred threat object. Evidence of access. A statement about proximity. Proof of presence that the victim was meant to discover and interpret correctly. In both of those prior cases, the knife was left because he had decided not to proceed that night. In both of those prior cases, there was a subsequent contact. She told me this in a measured, professional tone, because she was a professional and this was information I had a legal right to, and she was not responsible for what it did to me once it was in my possession. I drove home to Palmer in daylight, on a road I knew, past the gas station in Wasilla where I had eaten a sandwich in my car and watched a family load their Subaru and felt the glass distance of my own separate life. Ptolemy was waiting at the door. The apartment was warm. I sat on the floor next to my cat for a long time without turning on any additional lights, because the light that was already there felt like enough, and I was afraid that if I moved something might shift. That was 2 years ago. The camera sits on the shelf in my bedroom. I have not taken it out. I do not drive north of Palmer after dark. I sold the telephoto lens last spring. I canceled the Sky and Telescope subscription. I sleep with my bedroom door locked even though I live alone. What I dream about is not the knife and not the body impression and not the 40 meters of dark between me and whatever was lying on that shelf. What I dream about is the 11-minute exposure, the aurora in the upper third of the frame, green and violet, enormous and indifferent and breathtaking, and in the lower right, that pale thermal smear, that human shape, perfectly still. Looking at the camera. Looking at me. Lying there in the dark waiting to be found, or waiting for me to keep my back turned 1 minute longer, or waiting for something I will never know the name of because the calculation was made in a mind I will never have access to. The aurora is still up there. December, above the Talkeetna Range, it performs without an audience. I know because I check the forecasts. I check them every night. I don't know why I keep checking something I'm never going to go back to see. I think maybe that's the most frightening thing of all.